So this video introduces what's certainly David Hume's most famous argument, his argument against the possibility of deriving any knowledge of causation from reason. This is what's earned him the reputation as a skeptic about causality and science. And it's the argument that was said to have woken Immanuel Kant from his dogmatic slumber. And we'll see that part of the argument is going to be a revolutionary account of what belief is that will figure into some of his other arguments. So by far, this is the most important day of our section on Hume. So the first part of Hume's argument is to split our reasoning into two different kinds. All of our knowledge, or all of our reasoning can be said to be either relations of ideas or matters of fact. Relations of ideas are sometimes called a priori, a Latin phrase that means prior to the senses. They arise from the law of non-contradiction. Hume will say that the contrary of those is impossible. We say that we know that a triangle must have 3 sides, because to say that it has 4 sides or 5 sides is literally a contradiction of the definition that's already contained in the idea. So relations of ideas all arise from the law of non-contradiction, just spelling out what's already contained in that idea. Later, Kant will make this more clear by saying that those types of statements are analytic, in that they only analyze or spell out what's already contained in some idea. The second type of knowledge is knowledge by matters of fact, and that's a posteriori, which means posterior to or depending upon experience. So they come from experience. I know that the cat is on the floor or that the dog is barking from hearing it. I couldn't deduce those without having those experiences of them. They're statements of what is actually the case. And Hume is going to say, since they depend upon experience, the contrary of those is always possible. It's possible the cat isn't on the floor. It's possible the dog isn't barking. It's possible that the sun won't rise tomorrow. All of those things are things that we learn from experience as matters of fact. And Hume thinks that it's that third great principle of association that we talked about last time that is really the source of all of our knowledge about matters of fact. And it's only by matters of relations of cause and effect that we come to know anything that isn't directly present to us. So I can see right now that I'm speaking and that I can see the screen and the slide that's on the screen and the billiard balls that are in front of me. But knowledge that isn't directly contained in my experience, knowledge, for example, that if you strike the yellow ball in front of us with the cue ball or the white ball, that the yellow ball will move, that comes from my knowledge, my principle of association called cause and effect. I'm led to believe the matter of fact that the yellow ball will move. The billiard ball example of causation comes from Hume and is his most famous example of how causation works, as we'll see. So here's the argument. It's sometimes called Hume's horn or Hume's dilemma because it breaks all of reasoning up into one of two things and then gives an argument that no matter which of those two it is, it's impossible that our knowledge of cause and effect has any rational basis. So Hume thinks your expectation that the ball will be moved when it's hit, your expectation that when you drop something it will fall, your expectation that the sun will rise tomorrow are not at all based upon reason. And as far as reason goes, you have to be completely skeptical about whether effects that happened in the past from certain causes will continue to act that way in the future. And he's going to argue that it's impossible that our knowledge of the future, our knowledge of cause and effect, could come from any scientific reasoning, either by relations of ideas or matters of fact. So once he rules out both of those, then he'll see that reason can't be the source of our beliefs about causation, and we'll see what in fact is the source of that knowledge. So in some ways, this argument is the culmination of the great project of modern philosophy. Descartes started it with his skeptical argument, the dream argument, that said you can't trust anything that comes from experience. But he tried to show how you could get outside of your mind and come to know scientifically the primary properties of things and their causal powers. Hume is finally going to be, after 2 centuries of trying to get clearer and clearer about what substance is and about what ideas are, Hume is going to come to the conclusion that, in fact, we can't rationally know what to expect in the future from our knowledge of causes in the past. That science, in fact, can't use reason to discover the basic features of the natural world. And it's that radical conclusion to the modern project that woke Kant from his dogmatic slumber and will cause him to revise the whole conception of modern philosophy that we get from Descartes. So let's look and see how the argument works. We're going to look at each of these 2 different horns of the dilemma in turn and see why it can't come from relations of ideas, it can't come from matters of fact, and therefore it can't come from reason at all. The first part of the argument, and most certainly the most important one, is that it can't come from reason. It can't come from relations of ideas. Remember, relations of ideas merely spell out what's already contained in a concept, and to deny them would always involve a contradiction. Hume thinks that there's nothing in the cause that already contains the effect. There's nothing in the fact that the night goes on that makes you automatically have to think of the sun rising. There's nothing in the cause of releasing your fingers that automatically implies that the ball might fall. And nothing in the cause of the ball striking these other balls that implies that they will move. Nothing in the idea of the hammer that automatically, logically implies that the window will break. And the sign of that is that we can imagine that the ball won't fall. We can imagine that the ball rises when you let go of it. Hume says we can imagine that when one billiard ball hits another, it wouldn't move it. It would explode or shatter or pass through it. In fact, any of a number of different possibilities are possible. So from the fact that you cannot imply or infer the effect from the mere idea of the cause, and the effect is not contained already in the idea of the cause, and that it's always possible to imagine the contrary of any effect. It's never impossible. It never entails a contradiction, like saying that a triangle has 5 sides. Hume thinks that it's impossible to deduce scientific laws from reason. This quote here from section 5, part 1, is a good indication of how skeptical Hume is of our using reason to know what really causes things and getting at the heart of things. He says the ultimate springs and principles of nature, of what causes gravity and elasticity and cohesion of parts, are totally shut up from human curiosity and inquiry. As far as our mind is concerned, there's no contradiction in assuming that any of the laws of nature would simply cease to hold. The most perfect of the philosophy of the natural kind, that is the most perfect science, only staves off our ignorance for a little longer. So here Hume thinks he's refuted all of Descartes and all of the rationalists who thought that you could deduce all of the laws of nature from that light of nature, from reason itself, merely because Hume thinks once we examine our ideas, which are merely paler copies of impressions, I can't deduce the ball falling from the impression or the experience of my hand releasing it. I can imagine that the ball did other things. So if it can't come from relations of ideas, the only other possibility is that it come from experience. That's how we get our knowledge of cause and effect of the present. But experience only tells us about what's happening here in the present moment. So I know now that this hammer hitting the glass broke it. But I want to know whether when I strike the glass with the hammer in the future, will it also break? And of course, that fact that I get from experience in the present doesn't imply this fact about the future unless I make an additional assumption, unless I assume that the future will be like the past. But of course, that's exactly what we're trying to prove. So if I were to make that assumption and put it into my premises, my argument would be circular. So Hume argues that any attempt to deduce cause and effect in the future from the present, it will always be circular. It will always be assuming what it sets out to prove, that in fact that the future will be like the past. So knowledge from experience only tells us about the present. It can't tell us about the future unless we make that additional circular assumption that the future will be like the past. So cause and effect can't come from reason. It can't come from experience. So Hume thinks that there's no rational basis for cause and effect. As far as reason is considered, the ball may not fall when you let go of it. The sun may not rise tomorrow. The glass may not break when you strike it with a hammer. The earth may not continue to revolve on its axis or go around the sun. Before we look at the solution that Hume proposes and explains how we do come to our belief about all of those things, it's useful just to at least consider an objection. I've been thinking about this since I first took this class over 30 years ago, and have been thinking that most scientists would think that that first horn of the dilemma is false. Science is based upon using mathematics to deduce laws about nature. On the right, you see an image that illustrates Sir Isaac Newton's deduction of the law of gravity, or the inverse square law, which is that if we geometrically project something into space and let it spread out, the amount of it that will exist on any portion of space will decrease proportional to the square of the distance that it is from the object. And that's the basis of Newton's third law, the great gravitational law, that says the gravitational force between two objects will decrease proportionally to the inverse square. So Newton would have thought that that law follows from the geometry, and that if you tried to imagine that it didn't, you would get a contradiction in the mathematical laws that govern that situation. I won't go through this more general form of this argument in detail, but you might think that identical objects will always act identically. And because they're identical, the law of identity says that if A is the same as B, it will have the same properties. And if it doesn't, that's a contradiction. So you might think that similarity between causes is really a type of identity, and that inferring that the future will be like the past really arises from the identity of the formal situations or the forms involved in them. Now, of course, that's not Hume, and Hume would disagree with that. But remember, in the final, you're going to have to decide which of these various different views of causality you agree with or disagree with. The scientific view of causality and necessity we get in Galileo and Descartes and Spinoza disagrees radically with this skeptical view of causality we get from Hume. And we'll see one more fundamental view of causality when we get to Kant, who will try to solve this problem in a radically different way. So if Hume is a skeptic about reason and causality, and a skeptic about science, and thinks that we don't deduce any of our scientific knowledge or knowledge of causality from reason, how does our knowledge or belief in cause and effect in science come about? And Hume thinks that the principle that explains the origin of all of our belief is what he calls the principle of custom or habit. It's merely a constant conjunction of cause and effect that produces a psychological habit or association that produces the effect when we see the cause. Remember, Hume had his 3 laws of psychology, of similarity, contiguity, and cause and effect, as the principles of association that guide the motion or the mechanics of our ideas or our thought. And he thinks that what causes us to have beliefs is not anything rational, but is a psychological law, one whose origin in the brain or in the physical world we're just as ignorant of as the source of the attraction between massive objects in the solar system. So it's custom and habit that accounts for all of our belief and all of our knowledge. That principle is probably the most important thing to remember about David Hume. Just as there's one big idea to remember in each of the philosophers. If I ask you a question about Hume and you answer custom or habit, you're likely to get at least part of it right. Because for Hume, all of our beliefs are going to arise by custom or habit. And let's see why that would be and how that works and what exactly belief is. And we'll see just how far we've gotten from Descartes' view of the Archimedean standpoint. Descartes would think that belief is something that the rational part of us, the light of nature, can step outside of itself to a completely objective standpoint and view with its light of nature, with its true idea detector, whether something is true or false or not. So for Descartes, belief would be a completely objective standpoint by which our natural faculty of reason can see the truth of things, like Spinoza's adequate idea. But for Hume, it's going to turn out that human beings are not objective in that sense at all. They're not angels or disembodied souls. They're biological creatures governed by psychological laws, and belief is a psychological fact, not a rational fact. Belief is going to turn out to be a feeling or a sentiment. Things that we believe have more force and vivacity. That concept that Hume said distinguishes an impression from an idea. When we actually have an experience, it comes to us forcefully, and we believe that that is what we're actually seeing. And ideas fade, are merely paler copies of impressions. So as ideas age, they decrease in force or vivacity unless something reinforces them. When we believe something, it appears to us forcefully in a way that makes it necessary for us psychologically to attach belief to it, which is just this sentiment or feeling that it's true, that comes from the great force and vivacity with which it presents itself to us. That's why we believe our eyes, because those impressions that we get directly from our eyes have great force and vivacity, greater than the memory, which would have been a paler copy of that impression or an idea. So the 3 great laws that we looked at of resemblance and contiguity and cause and effect, they're simply ways in which not only ideas will pass to ideas, but in which belief or the force and vivacity will transfer from one idea to another idea. It might help you to think of the transference of momentum. If you go back to the Newton's cradle here, how the energy in the ball was transferred to this ball and then to that ball and then to that ball. So in the same way, resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect are ways in which belief or force and vivacity will move from one idea and transfer that force and vivacity or belief into another idea. So you see me and I say something mean to you and you come to the belief that I'm a jerk. If you see another person tomorrow who looks like me, that force and vivacity of that sentiment that I'm a jerk will pass on to the person that you see now who's similar to me, and you'll form the same belief that you had about the thing that's similar to me. So if you see a person, if you see the chair next to you and a person comes and sits down next to it, you'll have the belief that that person will sit there. If you come and see the same chair the next day, near in space and time to the original chair, then you'll transfer that sentiment or belief and you'll come to believe that your friend will come and sit next to you on this day, which they haven't done yet. And the primary principle for transferring force and vivacity from past to future is going to be cause and effect. We see the lightning and we're led to expect the thunder. So when I see lightning again, the force and vivacity associated with the constant conjunction of those in the past will be transferred and produce a vivacious or powerful belief that the thunder will occur in the present as well. So those three principles are principles that guide the transfer of force and vivacity, or the force of belief. And what we call that principle of transferring force and vivacity, the way in which constant conjunction, which is the source of our knowledge of cause and effect, constant conjunction produces a transfer of force and vivacity again and again and again. Seeing the same thing transfers more vivacity and more vivacity. So I'm really certain that the sun is going to come up tomorrow because I saw it once and some force and vivacity was transferred. I saw it again. I saw it again. Like each day you get a little deposit of force and vivacity into the bank account of belief that the sun is going to rise. So I'm very, 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 very certain that the sun will rise tomorrow. Not because I have any rational basis for that belief or because I can prove it, but because it's happened so many times and this transfer of force and vivacity has accumulated into that idea that now I cannot help. It's so forceful in my mind that psychologically I can't help but believe it. So, this is the basis of certain types of brainwashing because you can transfer force and vivacity in different ways. If I wanted to torture you into believing something, I could just shock you every time you try to say that it's not true until finally there's so much force and vivacity against you saying it that you wouldn't believe it. So for Hume, belief is just this hydraulic matter of balancing force and vivacity. If there are two competing beliefs, you'll see how much force and vivacity is stored up in each one of them through the system of transference. And the different beliefs will battle it out, and the one with the most force and vivacity will naturally win. But all of our beliefs are like deposits or banks in which large stores of force and vivacity have been deposited by this repeated experience through a resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect of producing those sentiments or feelings of a powerful and forceful idea which makes us believe in it. So just to add Hume to our summary of what the different objects are for Locke and for Berkeley. So a sensation of red for Hume would be an impression. An idea would just be a different impression. He would have thought that there are no abstract ideas. He agrees with Berkeley there and thinks that abstractions are just words that are associated with a custom or habit through those three laws of association that can bring many ideas to mind. We'll talk about identity and God a little bit later, but now we've just seen that our belief in causality is nothing more than a habit or custom that comes from a constant conjunction and experience that produces a very forceful and vivacious idea and produces the sentiment of belief. And that our knowledge of causation isn't based upon any of these rational inferences. We'll see this notion of belief applied in lots of other different areas of Hume's philosophy in the coming lectures.